Right, so greetings, hello, it's Dr Thomas Daffern here, with a guest this time, who's come all the way from Sweden. So this is my normal weekly broadcast that I've been doing for the last 6 months almost. I've been fasting every Sunday and talking about philosophy and the state of Europe and the world, mainly against Brexit, but many other things like wars in the Middle East and Israel, Palestine, how we can get peace, all that kind of thing.
Right, yeah.
So it's nice to welcome you, and visiting all the way from Sweden.
Yes, thank you so much.
Yeah, and I thought that instead of just me talking like I normally do, you know, monologue, I thought it'd be fun to have a dialogue.
Yeah, absolutely.
A sort of interview, straight conversation.
Yeah, yeah.
So maybe you could introduce yourself first to our guest.
Okay,
yeah.
My name is Cecilia. I'm a Swedish Wiccan since about 20 years back. I run a coven with my high priest in Sweden since 2013. And I'm also a druid since a year back. So yeah, that's a little bit about me.
Mm. Okay, and you work in education, that's your sort of professional field in Stockholm, right?
Yeah, that's correct.
Yeah.
I work in an education company, that's right.
Excellent. Okay, and you're also mother, you've got a daughter, so you're concerned about life and the future of the world.
The future, yeah, absolutely.
The future generations.
Yeah, it can be very worrying, absolutely.
Yeah. Good. Okay. So, what's going to be slightly different about this conversation, this interview, is that yesterday I showed you a discourse I'd recorded about a year ago, a film.
Yeah.
About an interesting experience that happened to me in 1999, right? Which I've not really gone public about before. It was a past life regression I had in America, in Oklahoma, and I've written this up in my autobiography, volume 4, in some detail. And you watched this yesterday.
Yeah, I watched it. I thought it was really interesting, you know.
Right. And so you thought you had some questions about it that arose.
Yeah, that's
which might arise in the minds of lots of other people if they ever listen to this. I mean, as I say, I've not really gone public with it. Very few people know about this past life regression.
Oh, fantastic! And I get to honour to ask about it.
You're one of the first who's ever found it. Only my very closest friends I tell.
Right.
But I feel the need to go more public with it now.
Right.
Because I think it might help resolve some of the conflicts that are waging in the world, interfaith conflicts and stuff. I think that past life regression shone a bit of light on it all.
Right. And so, from my perspective, it was a fascinating story. So also there, and something to think about, you know. Right. What it could mean.
Sure.
Is it real, and so on.
Okay, so what we're going to assume for the sake of this discussion, this interview, is that people have watched that earlier video. They've listened to the talk. They know the past life regression details.
Right. Maybe you could just briefly go over it.
Okay, if you think so. I won't go into all the details.
Right.
But because they can watch it, in a separate talk. But basically, in the past life regression that came up, it was done in a place in Oklahoma called Sparrowhawk Village, which was run as an educational centre by a dear friend of mine, Reverend Carol Parrish, had founded it. Very charismatic Cherokee Catholic woman who'd studied esotericism for many years. She she's more or less retired now, and the village doesn't function as it used to when I was there. But in those days, in the 90s and 80s, they had a whole variety of speakers coming, visionaries, elders, spiritual teachers from all over the planet. Amazing woman. And she tried to get an international network of spiritual academies set up. And that's how I met her, because I hosted the conference in London for that project. And we had people, light workers, come from Russia and Israel and India and America and all over the world, you know. And so we began the discussion. She invited me back then to go and give some workshops in America.
Right.
This is before 9/11. This is just before 9/11. So it's 1999, right?
Mm.
And the symbolism of all that is pretty amazing, really. And so, yes, there'd been a previous speaker who'd been there for 2 weeks before I was scheduled. I had a week booked to run a workshop, training people in the arts of interfaith mediation, which I was writing up for my PhD at the time. Okay. So she said, come and do a training course, Thomas, you know, and we got about 25 people to come and volunteer. But the week before, there was this other guy who was teaching people past life regression techniques. He was quite famous, he's written books about it. He's one of America's most important past life regressionists.
Right.
And she wanted volunteers to come, and like they had lots of people that wanted to train, but they didn't have enough volunteers to allow themselves to be regressed. So they said, well, since you're coming to give a workshop, would you like to be one of the volunteers, like in the couple of days before you do your teaching? And I said, okay, you know, I'd never had an official past life regression before. So I said, okay, you know, I'll volunteer. And it was, you know, I was up for the experience. And it was with a very interesting woman who was a trained minister of the church called Catherine. I give all the details in my write-up of it. And Catherine, you know, that's the only time I've met her. I haven't met her since. I'm assuming she's still alive. Bless her. She was a lovely young woman, well, sort of middle-aged, and was doing the course to be a past life regressionist, and they'd obviously trained her and all that. So I was. It took place in the library at Sparrowhawk Village, which was a beautiful, beautiful room. You know, I love libraries. Yeah. As you know, I live in a library. And it was a huge long table in the library, which they put a mattress on. It's all comfortable with pillows and blankets. Yeah. And then, you know, the whole thing unfolded. You can read about it. And then I found myself back in ancient Egypt. This is a very summary version of it. You can read all the details, which you've heard me explain.
Yeah, I heard her talk.
Yeah. So I found myself back in ancient Egypt, and it was like watching a movie, and you know, it was a strange experience, because you kind of think, am I making this up? You know, like, where's this coming from? It's like watching a waking dream, and I wasn't totally hypnotized or anything. You're in a very light trance, I'd say. It's like a hypnotic trance type light thing. But the first thing is you're totally relaxed. So there's a 20-minute lead-in whilst every part of your body relaxes, and it's like almost going to sleep. And you can hear this voice speaking, saying, and now, you know, blah, 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 and now, so that you're aware of the voice. So it's like you're looking down on something from above. It's almost like being out of body, like an out of body experience.
Yeah.
And it was like I was out of body looking down on a former life, or this life of, you know, a spiritual teacher in ancient Egypt attached to a temple. And she asked, you know, what's the era? When is this? And I said, well, it's the time the Romans are running Egypt. You know, this was during the Roman era of Egypt, which is not what I thought it would be, because I thought most ancient Egyptian stuff is much earlier. I thought this would be, you know, Ramesses and the old Imhotep and all the gang.
Yeah.
But no, this was like Romans, what?
Like Cleopatra and Anthony. And
yeah, that kind of era, yeah. And so then it unfolded, and I was the spiritual, like, professor of studies attached to this temple. It was a temple school. So these temples were not just, you know, they were educational institutes as well, where you did your training as priests and priestesses, and you could do the equivalent of very advanced studies, which involved initiations and learning. It was a highly literate temple. We were not too far from Alexandria. We had access to the library in Alexandria, which was the greatest library in the world, and I would go there, and we would have people come and borrow scrolls and all that.
You must have loved it.
Well, of course, it was. I mean, I loved that life. It was paradise, you know.
Yeah.
And we also were literate in Egyptian, but also in Greek, So we had access to all the Greek philosophical works as well. You know, it was amazing. And we had visiting students coming from all over the world. I had Celts, I had Druids studying in that temple. It was a famous temple school.
Right.
You know. So that was the life. And then what comes up as because she kept saying, okay, now go forward a year. What are you doing? And, you know, I'd get sort of new pictures and new images, and then go forward another year, and so on and so on. And it turned out I had one particular student who was a very advanced, somewhat precocious and highly intelligent student,
Right.
who in the end caused me some grief, you see. And I explained about that in my detailed discourse, you know, which hopefully people have heard. Okay, that's in a nutshell what happened.
Well, it's not completely what happened, is it? Well, assuming people have heard your talk then. So, this experience, I mean, you must have been curious how it matches up to like history, because you're also a historian. So like, have you looked at it, like trying to find details? Does it match up and so on?
Obviously that's a good question, and that was my first kind of like thought.
Right.
Like, is this just a fantasy my unconscious has cooked up, like a dream, waking dream?
Right.
Or could this actually be real, this past life, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, did such temple schools exist? How do we know? Etc., etc. And I did look into it, and you know, just because people will know who've watched the earlier talk I do about this, that student that caused me a lot of trouble and grief and anxiety turned out to be a young rabbi from Palestine, Israel, Judea, Galilee region.
Right.
And he's known to history as Jesus of Nazareth, you know, Rabbi Yeshua, the Messiah, has many names, right?
Right.
Well, I knew him as an apprentice student of the mysteries, who was brilliant. I loved him. You know, he was my best student, right? But he had to do everything his way. He was extremely like self-willed, precocious, and wanted to do it when he wanted to do it, right? And as I explained, what came up in the regression was that he never finished his training. He didn't do his final initiation. It's like you're a Wiccan, you've done your 3 degrees, right? You've been through. So he only did his 2 degrees, as it were. He never came back for the 3rd degree, which would have given him the authority to then teach as a high priest, or like up to the highest level of learning.
Well, that brings me to the next question about this 3rd degree.
Yeah.
You called it, I think, the goddess degree or something like
That's
that.
right. There was a goddess initiation that he never came back for. He left Palestine saying, I'll come back next year and we'll do it then.
Right.
And I was reluctant to let him go, because I've had students come and go and they say they're going to come back and they never do. And I didn't want this guy to flunk it. So I said, no, just wait a few months and we'll do it, you know, in the next batch.
Right.
And he swore to me, no, I'll come back, I promise you. You know.
Understand. But could you explain like the importance of it? Like, for example, if a leader today would have the goddess initiation, what would it mean? What difference would it make, you know, on a person?
Okay, so what came up in the initiation, in the regression, that was a teaching to do with compassion and humility.
Right.
Because since the goddess is everything, every woman, every tree, every stone, everything on Mother Earth, once you've had that initiation, you can no longer be arrogant at all. Your ego goes, right? And you become a total servant of the absolute in the detail of everything.
Right.
And he kind of had it intuitively. You know, he was very good. I mean, compassion and love was his thing, right? And help for the poor, the sick, and all the rest of it. But there was an element, a trace of I'm the king of Israel still in him. There was an ego. You know, I'm the Messiah, I'm the chosen one of the chosen ones.
Maybe a bit impatience, like wanting people to understand how great this is.
I think that's possibly an explanation for why he didn't come back. He thought, look, I know it all already, I don't need to come back, you know.
Right.
I'm already compassionate and humble enough,
Mhm.
you know, because like he was always stressing humility, right? I'm the most meek. But if you read carefully the texts, like when he goes into the temple and whips everybody and overturns the money changers, you know, this is not compassion. This is an angry, impatient guy who is trying to have it his way, you know.
Yeah.
And then that, of course, caused the black backlash of the anti-Jesus party that then crucified him. Now, if he'd have had his goddess initiation, this is my understanding, he would have chosen a much wiser path. Instead of direct confrontation with the forces of ignorance, which is what we're dealing with, the goddess initiation teaches you to work with the people who are manifesting the ignorance, and then educate them in spite of themselves,
Right.
so that you put yourself into their shoes, you know, and can stand with them and help lift them up from within their own psyches.
Right.
Because nobody wants to be ignorant. Nobody. Can you imagine being in the mob that was shouting for Christ's crucifixion? You know, the karma of that. How horrible when you realise what you've done. Well, nobody in their right minds would want to be in that mob.
I think people
So-
are still doing it, just in different ways, actually. Sadly.
Well,
Like when people
humanity
are being
as a whole
crucified
hasn't
in
had
the
its-
newspapers, for
Yeah,
example. I think
And-
that's a
yeah.
bit of the same thing.
sure.
Not as lethal, maybe.
Well, no, sadly, I mean, the mob is still braying, and you know, with the resurgence of extreme polarization in the world today, everywhere you look, there's narratives of absolute good versus absolute evil,
Yeah.
and this causes violence.
Mhm.
And everybody, of course, thinks they're on the side of the absolute good,
Of course. Yeah.
and the other guy's on the side of absolute evil. You know,
Yeah. Yeah.
one of the things about the goddess initiation, you know, as I recall, is that it teaches to reach a place beyond such simplified polarization narratives,
Mm.
because everything is the goddess, every light and shade, every colour of the rainbow.
Mm.
Therefore, you can't sit in judgment against that, because the goddess is, you know, the mother, the maiden, the crone. She's Kali as well as, you know, the beautiful nubile spring maiden, and you know,
Yeah.
we've got to go the whole journey with her.
Yeah, I think some people say God doesn't make mistakes. I usually say the goddess doesn't make mistakes, but you know, same thing, right?
Sure.
Um,
Okay. Anyway,
right.
hope I've answered your question.
Well, I was interested in the way his teaching was described as becoming like perverse teachings, like they became twisted and became something else, and it became dogma. And if you had, and it was sort of like what we were just talking about, like it had to be in a certain way.
Yes.
How do you think that happened? Why?
Gosh. Yeah. That's huge, an important question. So in that past life regression that came up, she kept taking me forward like a year or 2 or 10 years at a time.
Right.
And we got to, I was waiting for the student to come back, and he didn't. And because we had other students coming to and fro from Palestine and that region, we heard this teacher had become a teacher.
Right.
And had attracted many students, and seemed to be like a bright, shining star, and was even doing miracles. You know, we heard reports, and he was doing incredible stuff.
Mhm.
And then, and I thought, I know who this is. You know, and I was slightly worried because I thought, hang on, he hasn't quite finished his training.
Mhm.
He's going off like half cock, we say in English, and trouble's going to happen maybe, because he had this confrontational style, which you see in the Gospels all the time, you know. And I was worried about that. And so lo and behold, then I heard he'd been crucified, killed, like horrendously, humiliated
Right.
by the establishment. And I just like, you know, wept, pulled my hair out, and I said, but, and on the other hand, I kind of expected it.
Mm.
I knew it was going to happen because of his lack of preparation.
Mhm.
Lack of, so I wasn't surprised, but I was shocked still, and I felt almost like personally guilty. I should have kept him back. I should have, you know, insisted he had his final initiation and not let him go like a lamb to the slaughter.
No.
So I sort of took a bit of guilt on that. And then I began to hear some amazing other reports, like in the months and weeks and years that followed, which is that, lo and behold, he'd done the resurrection experience. He'd done the Osiris mystery, right?
Right.
Like he'd been dead and then he'd risen. And people started coming back to our temple and saying, did you hear? That crazy teacher used to have, he's done the resurrection, you know. And I when I tapped into that past life, I was I always suspended judgment. I was an academic as well as a priest. And I never had absolutely convincing 100% proof that that was the case. But I had a lot of people knocking on my door saying it was the case, or some. And I was prepared to say, the way I figured that was a very, very high initiation,
Right.
the Osiris resurrection, which is like only ever very rarely done. It was beyond my level of achievement. I can't do that. I couldn't do that. Like actually die and resurrect. That's something given, you know, I knew there were teachings about that, and I knew that some people might pull that one off. And I wondered to myself, is it possible that he was able to pull that off? Did he have other teachers that I didn't know about who were able to initiate him in that?
Yeah. So I'm curious about that resurrection from what you recall in the meditation.
Yeah.
What it is. I mean, do you truly physically die, and then you're like seeing your body and go into it and restart it somehow, or what in your opinion is it?
I think that the ancients were much more accustomed to death and near-death experiences than we realise. We think near-death experience is something we've just discovered because of hospital resuscitations.
Right.
But I think the ancients were quite familiar with that, like, nearly dead state. And they were using different medical compounds, herbs, potions and things that would stimulate death. And then they were able to get the dosage right so they would come back. And they'd be able to report on what they'd seen.
Right.
And we know, for instance, that in the Platonic schools of ancient Greek philosophy, which were based partly on the Orphic mysteries, they knew about life after death. The initiation experience in Eleusis was that you got a glimpse of life after death. And that was partly facilitated by a psychedelic substance that they gave you to drink, that Gordon Wesson's written a book about, which was a sort of form of LSD. And it stimulates a death and near-death experience.
Right.
And I think the ancients were doing this. And now, how does it work? And yes, I think it is a kind of near-death experience. And the person dies. Like, I think most of their bodily signs were shut down. I mean, even advanced yogis in India can do this. They can go into like a trance and outwardly they've died. Their heart has virtually stopped.
Right.
And I think, yes, their soul would look down on the body and so on. But then I think they're able to re-enter, as you say,
Right.
and reanimate it.
The way the stories you hear about in the hospitals when they see themselves from above and they come
Correct.
back. Right.
Yeah, yeah. So to me, that I think is probably the best explanation. I think when he was on the cross, he was able to like leave his body to survive the pain and
Right.
all that. Although he was also able, in a strange way, to, because he talks on the cross, he's also there.
Right.
It's a bit like this past life regression thing. You're in two worlds at once. So I was in the past life, and I was also in the library at Sparrowhawk Village. I was two places at once.
Right.
So, so I think that's kind of what, and scientists have worked on. There are different theories about, what the resurrection involved, but. So anyway, at that time, to go back to your other question about like the perversion of the teachings.
Right.
Initially, I was in awe of the whole event sequence, because I was now like a high priest, a teacher, and I thought, wow, did he pull that resurrection thing off? Amazing. Good on him, and fantastic, And however, because I lived quite a long life, as the years wore on, like a decade or two passed, some people began to turn up who began to slightly twist the narrative. And they began to say, yes, and he is the king of the universe. He is the absolute Messiah of all people of all history. And unless you believe that, you're evil and with the devil. Like they introduced this polarized absolutism between absolute good and absolute evil. So unless you 100% believe that Jesus died and rose from the dead for your sins, and become a Christian and are baptized, then you are evil and we will destroy you.
Yeah.
Became the narrative, which to me was such a twisting of the resurrection mysteries. And like, what? Like, it's like a scorpionic sting in the tail of something that should have been amazing.
Right, right.
That's the perversion that I saw right at the end of my life, as these kind of fanatics were turning up.
Right. So you talk a lot about, I mean, I know you as a Christian Druid.
Yeah.
And yet you talk about these things like reincarnation and other things that are rather pagan to me.
Sure.
So, and you also say in the talk that you still worship Thoth and Math. So will you explain a bit about that? How you're not a heretic?
Yes, so I've always had, I mean, since I became a scholar, since I spent years studying all different world religions, right, 30 years of intense study at university and extracurricular and then teaching. So I've dipped into all the different great world philosophies and religions, and I know there's a common core truth to them all.
Right.
And that's why I've done the periodic table of the world's religions. I can maybe talk about that later. In each of the great spiritual paths of humanity, be it Judaism, Islam, Christianity, whatever, Buddhism or paganism, or Hinduism or Islam, there's a common core universal truth, right?
Right.
And they use different names for the absolute. They use different names for the god and the goddess. In ancient Egypt, they were called the netters. That's the collective word for the gods. The netters are like almost energies. Like physics talks about different vibrational energy frequencies that make up different elements, and the periodic table of the elements. So to us, the Egyptian gods and deities are like the periodic table of the spiritual elements that make up the universe. So Thoth is present in this room whilst we're discussing rarefied ideas, intellectual stuff, Mart is there in this room when we're discussing justice and law and karma and the wheel of fortune and all the rest of it.
Right.
Jung calls them archetypes. And so there are these primal archetypes like justice, truth, learning, and the gods and goddesses reflect those in every culture, be it Celtic, Druidic, Buddhist, Hindu, whatever.
Right, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, we have a lot of those in Wicca too.
Yeah.
Yes. Let's see. Right. Well, so in this experience, you experienced this as a past life, and you describe Jesus as a man in training, so to speak, not a man.
Yeah.
So I expect you think he's a man, right? And not like the son, from divine intervention, conception, sort of.
Like the Son of God.
Yeah, right.
Well, no, I mean, yes and no, right? What people don't realise about this phrase, the Son of God, and it's caused so many troubles in history. I've actually written a paper about the Son of God as a concept. I've traced the history of this idea. In the pagan world of Hellenistic Egypt that I was from and that we were familiar with, the Son of Godship is a recognised status that you can earn, or that is devolved to you even by birth, for very evolved souls.
Right.
Who incarnate periodically on this earth. It's a bit like the avatar tradition in India. Some people just are like avatars from birth. And the stories of Krishna and Rama, they show it very early on. We know enough about Jesus that he had that magical charisma, that I mean, I had trouble with his strong will, but he obviously believed in his mission from very early on. And that's typical of that type. Now, So did Alexander the Great, who was again supposed to have been a miraculous birth. Alexander the Great's mother was a devotee of Dionysus,
Right.
and she claimed that he'd been born immaculately with a god. Alexander the Great's father was a god.
Oh,
And
right, of course.
don't know if you knew that.
I didn't know that, no.
Okay, so he was actually the son of a god, literally.
Well, yeah,
You
that
know,
explains a lot.
and she was. We would probably now call her a witch. Alexander the Great's mother was an amazing woman, and the father was suspicious. Poor
Was
old
he
Philip,
jealous of
Philip of
God?
Macedon. Yeah, he was jealous. He thought, God, what's she been up to, doing magic rituals, you know?
Right.
And there are other examples from history, like Hercules was the son of God, and but a human mortal mother.
Right.
And in Celtic druidical legends, Merlin is the son of a god.
Yeah, some call it a
Spirit
demon,
being.
you know.
Well,
but that's-
daemon is the Greek word for a divinity, you know.
Oh, right.
And the mother was, again, like Alexander the Great's mother, was communing with spiritual beings, and it was a divine conception.
Right.
So,
But,
yeah, I don't have. So, son of God is it's just like saying that guy is pretty amazing, and the daughter of the goddess is also part of that same package. Some women claimed like semi-divine status because of it.
right.
What I think happened is that unfortunately, the Christian theologians are not very well trained and educated. Some of them were, like Clement of Alexandria, but there were an awful lot of a batch of young, early Christian theologians who were very simplistic and not sufficiently au fait with comparative global philosophy, to put it in a nutshell. And they interpreted everything in absolute terms. You know, either you believe Jesus is the only Son of God, or you're a heretic and we have the right to burn you alive.
A bit narrow-minded.
Well, it's just ignorant, and that's unfortunately how it deteriorated. That was the perversion. So what started out as a totally acceptable, you know, there are sons of gods walking around who are amazing, you know, whether in India or China or wherever. It became like, you know, it was dumbed down, and then it began to be used as an anti-intellectual weapon. And the sophisticated schools of antiquity, such as my academy then, began to be threatened and eventually closed.
Right.
They persecuted philosophers like me in the name of their Christ, you see.
That's horrible.
That's what happened. And that's why I'm a Druid, you see, because the Druids survived. They kept alive the more sophisticated form of esoteric teaching in Britain and Ireland in particular, and in the Celtic world of Europe.
Right.
And refused to be killed off. You know.
Weren't they, though?
Which is why, well, no, they weren't. They carried on, you know, and still do to this day. They kept alive the ancient wisdom. As I say, in my past life recall of Alexandria and the Temple School, we had visiting Druids come there, you know, who were highly intelligent people. They learned orally, they didn't bother with writing at that time.
They had better memory, perhaps.
I think in those days people had, you know, you could memorise the whole of Homer. I mean, it's amazing. Even my grandfather's generation memorised the whole of the Bible.
Wow.
In the era of Facebook, we can hardly remember what we posted yesterday.
No, our brains become lazy or something.
Yes, as we've externalised it all into, you know, our laptops. Yeah.
Yeah. So, well, assuming that, you know, he is a man, and you are, you know, you were his teacher, and you have probably traveled through many incarnations, and now you're here, and where is Jesus now, you think?
That's a great question. I've asked that question myself many times, you know.
Really?
Because I'd love to know. I'd love him to come back for his final initiation.
Yeah.
Still,
Yeah.
and to join the team. You see, I think. Okay, I've set up this thing called WOMAD,